He first tried to contact me, or did contact me, back in December of 2012 when he sent me an anonymous email using the name Cincinnatus, which is the name of a 5th BC Roman emperor who had famously been recruited to become essentially the emperor of Rome to vanquish a foreign enemy, and then voluntarily gave up power after he succeeded and was at the height of his power and said, "I'm going back to my farm," and became sort of the symbol of civic virtue, somebody who uses power for the collective good and not for their own personal aggrandizement. And that was the name Snowden chose when he first contacted me. The problem was that he was afraid, for obvious reasons, the reasons that are now obvious, to tell me much about who he was or what he had. All he would say essentially was, "I have a story for you," but as you know, we get contacted every day by people claiming to have stories, often which turn out to be, most of the time, which turn out to be nothing. And so I didn't prioritize it. He wanted me to install encryption so that we could talk securely, and I never did. And he tried essentially for 7 weeks and finally gave up, and then went to Laura Poitras, my friend, the award-winning documentarian. She did have encryption, and we were able to start speaking that way about the story that he had.
And talk about what eventually brought you and Snowden to Hong Kong.
Well, when I first talked to Snowden, which was in the early part of May, he was a huge mystery, both to myself and Laura. All we knew was that he was claiming that he had access to incredibly incriminating documents at the highest level of the national security state, but we didn't know who he was or how he got those documents or even what those documents were. And from the beginning, he was insistent that we travel to Hong Kong in order to meet him. And the idea that he was in Hong Kong was quite mystifying, both to myself and Laura, and raised a lot of flags of suspicion, because we obviously assumed when it was time to meet him that we were going to be traveling to Northern Virginia or Southern Maryland, which is where most of the people who work at these agencies reside. And it was very difficult to understand why somebody with access to these kind of documents would be in Hong Kong, of all places. And he was a little bit reluctant to talk about that. I didn't push much to get information, because I didn't want to make him feel like he was being interrogated, especially early on, before a bond of trust had been created. And the only thing I said was, of course, I'm willing to come to Hong Kong, given the magnitude of what you're saying you're able to give me. But before I get on a plane and travel all the way across the world, I just would like to see some sample of the material that you're prepared to turn over. And he said that's completely understandable. He sent to me through encryption programs that he helped me walk me through step by step to install roughly 24 top secret NSA documents that I received sitting at my home in Rio de Janeiro. It was the first time any documents had leaked from this most secretive agency inside the U.S. government ever. The documents themselves were explosive. Among them was the documents detailing the PRISM program, in which the NSA had obtained access directly to the servers of the largest internet company so that they could get the emails and chats that they wanted directly. And so when I got that first set of documents, I knew that this story was very serious. The source was at least somewhat reliable, that it wasn't just a crank or a crazy person. And the very next day, I got on the plane. I flew to New York to meet with my editors at The Guardian. I met Laura there. And the day after that, on the first available plane, we flew the 16 hours to Hong Kong to meet Edward Snowden.
But even that, it wasn't as simple as that, because though you were a columnist for The Guardian newspaper, they were concerned. They wanted one of their trusty, older generation reporters to be there, too.
You know, I think one of the reasons why I wrote the book is because there's a perception of what has happened that's informed by hindsight, and hindsight often distorts the situation more than it clarifies. And you know, the challenges that we face very early on in that story, journalistically and legally and politically, were quite profound. And you know, we had no idea who it was that we were going to meet. We had no idea what he had done to get these documents, or what the legal ramifications were, or what the risks were of going to Hong Kong. In fact, the Washington Post, whom he had thought about involving, actually said that they were unwilling to send any of their journalists to Hong Kong because they were so worried about the risks. And so The Guardian understandably was worried about all of that. And as you say, I had only worked with them for 8 months. My deal with The Guardian was I write whatever I want and I post it directly to the internet, and you don't interfere in any way in what I'm writing. So I had barely worked with any Guardian editors at all, let alone on a story of this size. And so there was a lot of trust issues. I didn't fully trust them in terms of how they were going to handle a story like this. And they didn't fully trust me that they could, essentially stake the 190-year history of their newspaper on a story based on what I was telling them, given that we had no relationship. And so at the last minute, they did insist that this very trusted reporter, Ewan McCaskill, travel along with us. It was a last-minute sort of request, and it bothered Laura and it bothered me, and we were worried about what it would mean for the source, but we ultimately accepted it.
You write that Laura was particularly concerned that if this source, who you were going to meet in Hong Kong, were at the airport secretly sort of, checking you guys out as you came in and saw someone else with you, he might just disappear. He might just back out.
That was a big concern. I mean, we knew that this person was extremely well prepared. I mean, everything that he proposed to us had been thought through in a very detailed and systematic way. It was all incredibly planned. And so the fact that there was this major last-minute change, which was it wasn't just me and Laura, whom he trusted by that point enough to meet, were coming, but also this completely unknown person from The Guardian who just got thrown onto the end, was a major concern. And The Guardian said, you don't have to let him meet the source until you're ready. We just want him to go to be around and to sort of help and to be our eyes and ears. And we essentially agreed because I thought it was a reasonable request and I felt like we could manage it. But it was illustrative of the kind of challenge that we faced right from the beginning in doing this story with so many unknowns.
So tell us about the moment, Glenn Greenwald, that you laid eyes on Edward Snowden. How did you agree to meet and then do the interview?
Well, the meeting itself was incredibly intricate, and it was, right out of a spy movie, essentially. I mean, he was staying at a large hotel in Hong Kong, which itself was a little bit confusing. I mean, why would somebody who makes off with this amount of documents, you picture them in sort of a hovel of an apartment, and that's very obscure, so they can't be found. And he was staying at this sort of high-rise luxury apartment hotel in the middle of the most commercial district in Hong Kong, which was itself very surprising. And so he had selected a place in the hotel, and this is very illustrative of how Edward Snowden thinks, that was, in his words, not so trafficked that we will cause a scene by meeting there and be noticed, but not so obscure that it would be conspicuous if suddenly people were there. He found this, what he thought was this perfectly calibrated place, which was in this kind of bizarre room that had an enormous green alligator on the floor. And our instructions were to go to this room at 2 different times, 10 o'clock and 10:20, and to sit on the sofa in front of the green alligator and wait for him. And if he didn't show up on the first occasion, we were to leave the room and come back in 20 minutes and wait for him. On the second time, he asked us to speak code questions to hotel employees to ask, how is the food here, or when does the restaurant open, so that we could signal to him that things had gone well on the trip over, that we hadn't been followed. It was sort of a code question that he would hear as he hovered. And so we sat down as instructed at 10 o'clock. He didn't show up. We left. We came back at 10:20. A minute later, he walked in. And the big question was, how are we going to know that it's you? We know nothing about you. We don't know how old you are, what you look like, or what your race is, or even your gender. And he said, you'll know me because I'll be holding in my left hand a Rubik's Cube. And so he walked in, was holding a Rubik's Cube, came over to us, introduced himself, and that was how we met him.
I want to go to a part of that first video that appeared a few days later. The video when the world first saw Edward Snowden, filmed by Laura Poitras in Hong Kong.
The greatest fear that I have regarding the outcome for America of these disclosures is that nothing will change. People will see in the media all of these disclosures. They'll know the lengths that the government is going to grant themselves powers unilaterally to create greater control over American society and global society. But they won't be willing to take the risks necessarily to stand up and fight to change things, to force their representatives to actually take a stand in their interests.
Talk about Glenn Greenwald, that again, Edward Snowden, that first video that the world came to know so well. How long that interview was, what shocked you most by it, how long it took you to put online, how The Guardian responded to this video.
Well, the most extraordinary thing about this story, the most unusual and the most difficult from the very beginning, was that Edward Snowden, from the very first time that I ever spoke with him, told me that he was absolutely determined to identify himself as the source of these disclosures, that he didn't want to hide, he didn't want to remain anonymous. He felt a moral responsibility to come out and explain why he did what he did to the world. And, you know, that's extremely unusual. I mean, if a source comes to you with information that can send them to prison for the rest of their lives, they typically want you to even go to jail if it means that you have to protect their identity. He wanted the opposite. He wanted to come forward and explain to the world why he did what he did.
He didn't want to be Deep Throat.
He did not want to be Deep Throat. He wanted to be Edward Snowden, saying, I stand up and take responsibility for the choice that I made, and I want to explain to you why I made it. And so from the beginning, I felt this very deep responsibility to make certain that he would have the ability to send the message that he wanted to send, to speak to the world and be heard in the right light, in the right way, so that the perception of him would come directly from him. And the way that Laura decided that this would be best done would be to make a video so that he could literally speak in his own words, not speak through me, not speak through any newspaper or other media institution. And so the first thing that Laura did was, on the very first day that I met Edward Snowden, I interrogated him for literally 6 straight hours so that I could convince myself that he was an authentic and reliable person, that what he was telling us was true. And she said it was so fragmented and so detailed and so lengthy that she didn't feel like she could really put together a video that would really convey who he was.
Now, wait, let's just talk about who you are, Glenn Greenwald, what it means to be questioned by you. You're a constitutional lawyer by training.
Right. And, you know, I had spent, you know, many years before being a journalist, not just as a lawyer, but as a litigator, which means that I so many times would sit down at a table just like this with witnesses probably a little closer to me than you're sitting, and for days at a time bombard them with questions. And almost nobody can withstand that level of scrutiny if they're lying. The lies will always come out. And I felt very confident that if he were lying, that would come out. It'd be apparent in the questioning. And after 6 hours, I felt extremely confident that he was telling the truth about everything. There were no inconsistencies. There was no hesitation. He withstood all of it. I mean, we didn't let him go to the bathroom. We didn't let him eat anything or even have a drink of water. It was literally 2 feet away from me and asking questions. But Laura felt like that wouldn't make a very effective video because it was too fragmented and too detailed. And so Laura wrote up, I think, 20 questions, and I added maybe 5 other ones. And it was on the 3rd or 4th day that we were in Hong Kong, and we said, let's really do this video the right way, in a focused way, so that he's answering the questions that the world is going to want to know.
At any point, Glenn, were you afraid that Edward Snowden would disappear?
We were constantly afraid that he would disappear, not on his own volition, but because there was going to be a knock at the door and American agents or Chinese agents or Hong Kong local authorities were going to find out what he was doing and come and take him away. That was that threat, that fear was constantly hovering over everything that we did. And, you know, part of why he chose Hong Kong, ultimately, I found out, was because he felt like that would afford him the protection he needed from the U.S. government to be able to do the work that he wanted to do with the journalist whom he had selected. But yeah, that was always a serious concern.
Talk about what happened on the 5th day, what Edward Snowden said about some security having been breached, having to do with his home in Hawaii.
Yeah, I mean, you know, none of us had any idea what the U.S. government knew about what he had done. And so we were operating completely in the dark. And I got there on the 5th day that we were in Hong Kong, and he said, I found out some alarming news. And it was the news I had been waiting for, I thought, which was, he said that he had discovered that NSA officials, a human resources person and an internal NSA police officer, which I didn't even know exists, but the NSA has its own police force, and an officer from that police force had been dispatched to his home in Hawaii, which he shared with his longtime girlfriend, to essentially say, where is Edward Snowden, and why hasn't he been at work, and do you know what it is that he's doing, and do you mind if we search? And Snowden was certain that this meant that the government had detected that he was the source of these disclosures, and I had argued you the opposite, that I didn't think that they would send just a human resources person and a police officer to his home if they really thought he was the source of this massive leak. They would probably send FBI and SWAT teams and who knows what else. But neither of us was certain, and so the possibility that he had been detected in some way or was about to be was very real, and it accelerated the need to get this video ready so that we could have him appear before the world on his own volition.